When we hear the term Gothic today, it generally evokes the image of soaring cathedral spires, bright stained glass, monumental stone statuary, and colorful book illumination, all part of the last great epoch of medieval civilization. The Goths of early medieval history probably do not come to mind, though the architectural style was named for them by humanists in the Renaissance to heighten the contrast between what they saw as the barbarian art forms of the Middle Ages and the true art of their own era. The word Gothic still applies to the architecture of the epoch, though no longer exclusively and no longer disparagingly. Gothic art now refers as well to sculpture and painting, which developed in a rich variety of visual expression, powerful in conception and execution. All are the products of a period as essential to the formation of the Renaissance as was the latter's adaptation of ancient classical style. For in the Gothic period, lasting from the mid-12th to the 15th century, most of the elements of the modern world begin to appear. The 12th century had seen the culmination of Romanesque art, and by mid-century, the beginnings of Gothic. It was also the time of crusades and pilgrimage, the rise of towns, the foundation of cathedral schools, and then of universities. Latin classics were retrieved, Greek science and philosophy were rediscovered. The liberal arts were revived, and with them came the beginnings of a vernacular literature and the study of the physical universe. Architecture was the first, and for a long time the dominant, form of the visual arts in the Gothic era. It appears to have been invented at the Royal Monastery of Saint-Denis, just north of Paris, between 1140 and 1144, with the rebuilding of the Abbey Church at the initiative of Abbot Suger. There, by recombining many of the features of Romanesque architecture, the master masons achieved a system of building based on pointed arches, rib vaults, and buttresses. The great surge of Gothic building in the following century was mainly directed to the rebuilding of city cathedrals, the seats, or cathedra, of bishoprics. This reflects the shift of power in the church itself, from the great monastic centers that had dominated the Romanesque world to the emerging authority of urban bishops. More emphatically, it demonstrates the growing autonomy of cities, merchant guilds, and civic associations. Their cooperation and contribution were essential to the huge investment each of these great building projects represents. Each cathedral ultimately was as much a statement of civic pride as it was of ecclesiastical power. Gothic architecture began in the royal domain of the Ile-de-France. Before the century was out, this new style, called Opus Frankigenum, or Ars Nova by its contemporaries, spread abroad. Cathedrals such as Canterbury and Lincoln in England were being rebuilt as Gothic churches. Shortly after these developments, we find the beginnings of Gothic in Germany and the rest of Europe. Based as it was on new constructional principles, Gothic architecture could dispense with the heavy walls and internal vaulting that had buttressed the nave walls of Romanesque cathedrals. Great window areas in the clerestory were newly available, and the art of stained glass rapidly evolved to enrich the space. Images of saints, patrons of the guilds, and subscribers to the church accompanied holy images from the celestial hierarchy and sacred texts. The glass softened, colored, and filtered the light as it streamed into the great spaces of the church, causing the windows themselves to gleam and appear to hover above the congregation like a vision of the heavenly Jerusalem. Early in the 13th century, sculpture began to evolve as viable representation of visible form, reflecting, as it were, the new perceptions of the physical world. No longer wholly abstract or symbolic, statuary could express emotion or interaction. A radiant, smiling angel could impart his joyous message to a demure, pious Virgin Mary with appropriate and convincing gestures. Carved stone could replicate delicate fabric falling over flesh and bone, or almost any texture as required. Historically, the 13th century also marks one of the great moments of Christian revivalism, due almost entirely to the creation of two mendicant orders, the Franciscans and the Dominicans. Initiated by St. Francis of Assisi in 1215, the Franciscan order emphasized a direct appeal to worshippers through emotionally driven sermons preached in public spaces. Friars were encouraged to live among the poor, to survive by begging for alms, and to spread the word of God by speaking in the vernacular. In almost every way, this was a revolutionary movement. Common people who had never before completely understood the theological intricacies of Christianity, due to an inability to understand ecclesiastical Latin, were now introduced to basic ideas of the faith by humble preachers speaking their language. Audiences of common laypeople were urged to seek a highly emotional relationship with Jesus Christ, who was now characterized not as the symbol of Christian dogma, but as a martyr promising unwavering love and forgiveness. Great cathedrals provided many chapels to be endowed, furnished, and sustained by wealthy patrons and societies. Altars needed altarpieces, service books, and liturgical objects for the Mass. As a result, work in precious metal, ivory, manuscript illumination, and painting came into high demand. In the 13th century, Paris became the center of this production, especially during the reign of Louis IX. Gothic art saturated the sacred places of Europe. In the 14th century, it became a truly international Gothic style, as we call it even today.